Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm just going to let the webinar populate a little bit, and then I'll give you a more thorough introduction to the evening. Thanks so much. Yes, growing numbers. Yay. Okay, lovely. All right, so good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Jackie from Greenlight Bookstore, and we're honored to host tonight's event with Michelle Bowdler presenting her new book, Is Rape a Crime? A Memoir, an Investigation, and a Manifesto. She will be talking with Grace Talusan, so you're in for an excellent conversation. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Michelle and Grace and the team at Flatiron for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces right now, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection this way. Now, just a couple of housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of your fellow attendees on the top of your Zoom screen, exactly where it depends on your device. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and to interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author and panelist, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon down there that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A tonight to be answered later on in a part of the program, so just be aware of that. We are recording tonight's event, so look for video or audio versions on our social media channels later on. And importantly, tonight's featured book is Rape or Crime. It's available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore for shipping or curbside pickup. You care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores like us. Buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our interviewer for this evening is Grace Talusan. She was born in the Philippines and raised in New England. A graduate of Tufts University and the MFA program in writing at UC Irvine, she is the recipient of the U.S. Fulbright Fellowship to the Philippines and an Artist Fellowship Award from the Massachusetts Cultural Council. Talusan teaches at the Jonathan M. Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts and is a long-time member of Grub Street. She's the Fannie Hurst Writer-in-Residence at Brandeis University. The Body Papers, winner of the Restless Books Prize for New Immigrant Writing, is her first book. She'll be speaking with our featured author this evening, Michelle Bowdler. She's the executive director. Michelle is the executive director of health and wellness at Tufts University and a graduate of the Harvard School of Public Health. She is a recipient of a 2017 Barbara Deming Memorial Award and has been a fellow at Ragdale and at MacDowell. Bowdler's work has been published in the New York Times and has been nominated for 2 Pushcart Prizes. Her new book, Is Rape a Crime?, is an expert blend of memoir and cultural investigation, and Bodler's work is a rallying cry to reclaim our power and to right our world. Michelle is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then she'll be speaking with Grace and with all of you. Please take it away, Michelle.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you to Greenlight Books, and thank you to Grace Talusan, who I'm so excited to be with tonight. And I am going to start by reading a little piece that is taking place. It's not the beginning of the book. It's taking place. I am heading to a police station to give my fingerprints to help, I believe, help the officers potentially investigate and solve what has just happened to me. So that's what I'm going to read right now. And I'm starting in the middle. Let me just find it. Okay, here we go. After a while, a man in a short-sleeved shirt and clip-on tie calls out my name and gestures for me to join him at the desk. He has an ink pad and is looking at my filled-out form. He begins reciting it back to me. Is your name? Was your apartment broken into the night of? Do you live at? I nod yes to each one. It says you have roommates. Is that correct? Could they come over and give their fingerprints? After we confirm that I am indeed the person who filled out the form, He opens the ink pad. All right, he says, put your arm on the counter and let me do the rest. He grabs my hand and separates my fingers, taking each one and turning it fully to get the ink on them, then places each finger on the corresponding spot on the paper. My heart races as I watch my hand disappear under his flesh as he presses and turns. He smells of cigarettes. When he's done, he pushes a roll of paper towels in my general direction, but the ink has already dried and won't come off. It seems the stains on my fingers will be there for a while, and I wonder if anyone will think I'm coming out of the police station having been booked for committing a crime. Then I realize I don't care. So what if I did? I fuss with the dry paper towels, thinking I should look for a bathroom, when I become aware of a noise hitting my ears. It's a sound I know, but it's out of place. There's a dog barking somewhere inside the police station. It goes on for several moments. 3 short, loud woofs, a pause, and then 3 more. The detective who took my fingerprints has situated himself behind a typewriter. The dog barks louder and louder. I hear voices in another room yelling, "Shut up, for God's sakes. Be quiet, you dumb dog." I catch the police officer's eye. "You're all set. You can leave any time," he says. The dog barks again, and he drops his pen. He looks in the direction of the noise and then at me, just like a woman can't keep her mouth shut. And he smiles broadly at his joke. I stare at him, feeling the immediate need to escape. I wonder if anyone would block the exit if I ran for my life. The officer ponders his joke and laughs to himself. A week ago, a former version of me would have gotten up and effortlessly engaged this man in a discussion about misogyny, power, and politics. A week ago, I might have spent some time wondering about the woman this police officer was married to and whether she was afraid of him, or why he picked a job where he's supposed to protect people when he seems rather menacing himself. While an undergraduate at Brandeis University and immersed in feminist politics, I had studied rape's political context. Rape is power, rape is misogyny, rape is a weapon of war, but not its significant impact on individuals. During my senior year, a student was raped at the train stop near campus. A police bulletin warned students to be careful because something happened near the railroad tracks. They couldn't even say the word, a word too ugly and frightening to acknowledge in writing. The victim approached my friend group, upset by the headline, and we discussed the word choice sitting in the Women's Coalition office one night after dinner. "Why can't they say it?" the woman asked. "How will everyone know to take it seriously?" Her hand shook with a slight tremor, and I wanted to warm them with my own, but held back. Something happened could mean anything. Someone saw a coyote. They were mooned by some kids driving by, I said, regretting the latter example as too lighthearted. When people make the word unspeakable, it makes victims feel like they shouldn't talk about it. If even the police can't say it in a bulletin, what does that tell us? My friend Julie said. We worked with the survivor's permission to rewrite the statement in a story for the student paper with a bold-faced headline, "Something happened. It was rape." Julie and I wrote and edited it, showed it to the survivor so she could vet every single word. Then we bulk mailed the newspaper home to parents using the Women's Coalition budget for the huge postage charges. This action wound us up in the office of the Dean of Students, where it seemed like we might get into trouble until we argued about free speech and shamed him about the school's reluctance to tell the truth in the first place. Why was it so hard to write the word rape in the bulletin? Rape isn't a something. People can't evaluate their risk when you're so vague. What about that word scares you so much? We shouted at the dean over one another, and he let us go without even a warning. Another time, one of our professors suggested we invite Linda Lovelace to speak about how she had been forced to be in the film Deep Throat and had been exploited sexually and financially for years by her manager. I thought of rape then only theoretically, as a symbol of men's power over women, as a representation of patriarchy. I never once considered the psychological impact that extreme violence might have on one's sense of self and ability to function over years. As I leave the police station, though, I am so far away from that strong, self-assured woman of just a few days ago. I feel like she died a lifetime before. I miss her all of a sudden, her spunk and her youthful hubris disguised as wisdom. I miss her self-confidence and her ease. I miss her so much, it aches.
Thank you, Michelle. That's such a powerful reading, and even in such a short passage, you express and communicate so much about this experience that we don't even want to name. And, you know, to have the rape in your title so boldly in this question, is rape a crime, I think is incredibly important. So because you started with a reading about the police, I thought we might start there and think about the role of the police in this book and some of the ways that you're challenging them. So I'm just going to read like a clip from Honor Moore, the memoirist's endorsement. Tracking police inaction on her own case, Michelle Bowdler wields memory as a weapon, then a banner, to urge an end to this most wretched and devastating of crimes against women. And, you know, I'm really, because I'm a memoirist also, I'm interested in this notion about what do we do with our memories? What do we do with the worst ones? And what does it mean for us to do what you just did in front of all of us, which is read about some of the most painful experiences of our life. So that was related to the police, and so I'll go a little bit more focused on that. And so in thinking about narrative, the narratives that I've been taught in my life about the police is that they, you know, are who I should go to if I'm in trouble, and you know, they're going to take care of things. And, you know, I learned this in school, like when Officer Friendly came to my elementary school, but I also had it reinforced over and over again in fiction, in TV shows like Law and Order, SVU, movies, and all kinds of ways that we see the police's process. And it is a show, it's not real life. And so to satisfy, I think, viewers' needs for a show, everything gets wrapped up at the end of it. You know, like everyone gets, people get their day in court, and the person who is responsible has some kind of reckoning of some sort. And that's entertainment, really.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm so impressed and moved by what you've done in this book, which is give us your lived narrative and experience and what you went through. And yours is one story in hundreds, if not thousands, of stories. And I just think it's incredibly important that you've done that. So I know we're going to have more of a conversation than an interview, but I wondered how you felt about writing about the police, if there was any kind of intimidation or fear. I mean, the moment that you read for us is a moment, I think, that's, whether the person meant it or not, it's a very dismissive act for someone in power to make this joke when you have been victimized so brutally and are coming for help. So I just wonder about the range of feelings and emotions you had in writing the parts about the police, because it does not come off as vengeful at all, actually. I mean, there's feeling, but it's also very well researched, and there's clarity there.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, Grace. And you know, it's so interesting that the idea of confronting the police is so frightening in our society, as if the criticism and as if the accountability somehow they perceive as we've just endangered their lives. that because they do what they do, we're not allowed to hold them accountable. And I think that's a narrative that has done great harm in our society and is doing great harm right now to people who are not in positions of power and who often, when they see a police car and a siren going on, are terrified. And so I have a lot of empathy for people who don't report their crime. I don't judge them. I don't think, well, you know, that's where the problem lies, that we don't really know, we don't have good data really. I mean, what I present in the book, I say this is an estimate using federal data, because if you're trying to estimate on how many people reported, you're also trying to figure out how many people didn't report. And so how do you ever really get that exactly right? But yeah, I have been, even since the book came out, you know, I had a relationship, not a relationship, but a lot of interaction with the head of the Boston Sexual Assault Unit, trying to learn about my case. And I've been waiting. I've been waiting for him to call or to text me. And I feel nervous about it. Like I spoke the truth. The book is not only my truth, but it is the truth as I remember it. And I think I was firm without being, without having to decide that their experience matters more than mine, because it doesn't.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then the, you know, what you did at Brandeis as a student too, there's these ways that you've been, in your life, been challenging what you see as a norm, or that's like an unacceptable norm, and wanting to push against that. And you know, I've read your book, but hearing it again and hearing this attention to who you were before and after, because of course who you were at Brandeis was different from who you were after. And that happens with those of us who have been victims of crimes, in particular sexual assault, where there's this sense of before and after and how our lives are not the same anymore. Yeah. And, you know, I wonder about what are the ways that you've found ways to try to, you know, like find that voice, or find the parts of you that may have gone under, or you know, couldn't be out for a while because you were working, you had been victimized by this crime and were working through that.
Yeah, so when you ask that question, what I picture is the work that I do for a living, and sort of being part of a university environment where I would be in meeting after, and I'm talking maybe 10 years ago, being in meeting after meeting after meeting, talking about what we might do about sexual assault policy, for example. And hearing people, some people, not all people, but some people say things that were, you know, made me feel rage inside, and also sad. Like wanting to confront people, wanting to ask them to be held accountable. And at the time, not a lot of people did know my history. And I remember a friend of mine saying to me, if you tell them, they will actually listen less to you. That it would be used as a way to dismiss your beliefs, as if then, isn't that interesting, really? That, oh, well, that's just, you know, she's just traumatized and she's really has, you know, thin skin, as opposed to speaking from a voice of authority, and the work that I did working in health and mental health and health promotion, to say, actually, it's not he said, she said, and actually it's problematic to ask questions in this particular way. And I'd really like for us to think about some things to change. So So yeah, that really was what came to mind. And I can tell you, and I'm curious if you feel the same, that all that silence did was make me feel angry inside and frustrated and more powerless than having a voice would. And, you can see in the book, and just, if anybody's watching who's known me over many years, I feel like finding my voice and not feeling ashamed to talk about this happened to me. And because it happened to me, here's what I know. And it has really helped me. It helped me to speak out, and it actually helped me to write this book.
Yeah. So I relate to what you said about, not wanting to talk about it and this fear of being dismissed.
Mm-hmm.
And I wrote in my book about my experience with long-term child sex abuse. And there was a point in my life, after I'd told my parents and started getting treatment, we didn't go the police route at all. And there's various reasons for that. And some of it probably has to do with us being immigrants and kind of a fear and intimidation and mistrust and not sure like what was going to happen. But, I put it away, and I made that part of my experience never, like I would never talk about it. If it came up at all, like I would acknowledge that it happened, but I really would try to put that part of me in like a hidden room, because I didn't want to be, I didn't want to experience negative consequences over something that I had lived through, and that was no fault of my own. Right. And so I didn't want that story attached to me. But of course I wrote about it, and then I've taken the past couple of years to talk about it publicly. And, I know that you've the book just came out on Tuesday. And so you're taking this step now of being on book tour and talking about this very painful experience very publicly. And, for me, it was something that I needed to get used to. And I had to really, really take care of myself a lot, because I just wasn't used to talking about this part of my life. But I do think that it's incredibly important. Like, I've seen the power of it. I've seen the power of the fact that your book exists, and the fact that Alex Marzano-Lesnevich's book, who you spoke with Alex the other day for your event, and the fact that their book exists, I feel, and others too, like I don't feel alone with it. And there is something very important about us being able to speak and express in whatever way that we can, because Alex speaking helped me, and you being out here also with your book, there's a way that I don't feel so alone. And I really appreciate that work that you've done and that risk that you've taken to do that, professionally, personally, all these ways that we might risk. And so I wonder about how it's been a week or so, but I wonder about this difference between the expected and the actual. If you thought in your mind, even years ago, like what would it be like to tell this particular story to the depth and extent that you tell it? There's the research, the interviews. You're not only writing about and recounting about what happened and making meaning from there, which is difficult and enough, but you also are investigating it and also giving a manifesto.
So I was feeling very nervous about a week before the book came out. I did have a few moments of what have I done? What have I done? And then I would stop myself and think, I know exactly what I've done. But it was fear and probably a little shame, like those old voices that say, don't talk about it because you're going to make people uncomfortable, or they're going to think of you only in that way, that they will never not see that part of you when it really is only a part of you. I used to talk about how, and I don't remember if this made it into the final version of the book, but even if it didn't, I do want to share that, you know, for me, there was always a moment when at each and every person that I told, I would tell them what happened. Then they would say, did they ever catch him? And I had to change it to them. And then they would get this look on their face that I felt I mean, I guess I thought of it at the time as that it changed me, but I felt what I was seeing was something that I found intolerable, which was that it changed how they saw me. And maybe that's because I kept it so separate and thought I had to be seen in the way that I tried to present myself, which was probably kind of fractured if you think about it, because aren't we all, aren't we all the sum of everything that's happened to us? And, you know, what we do with it and how we make meaning is really part of what gives our lives meaning, and also that builds important relationships in terms of what you go through together, what you're willing to share. And I think there is something about being victimized that has a way of making people pull back into themselves. Trust is hard. Opening up is hard because you're always believing that you're going to be hurt in a very significant way. And your body isn't even sure it can tolerate even one more little prick on your skin. So, but the reality, for me anyway, and I'm curious if that's true for you, but the reality was that every time, the other thing that happened when I started to tell people was that a huge portion of people said, well, I'm going to tell you something. And in some cases, they had never told anybody else, but because I had disclosed, they felt they could disclose to me. And I found that, I want to say astounding, not that it, and not as a judgment, but sort of how meaningful that was, and how hard it must have been that they held that to themselves all those years, what that must have been like. And I can tell you that I don't see any of them any differently. I'm glad to know something about them that helps me maybe understand a little bit more about them, or makes me feel a little bit closer that they were willing to share anything that was hard for them.
Yeah, and I think that if we go back to what I said about narrative and the way that police have been written about or shown in movies and TV, there's a way that victims have been shown, and we only see the destruction. Like, yeah. Oh, they're never going to be the same again. Maybe their life is ruined now, like completely ruined. And, you know, what it must be like for people to encounter us and then to know our story. I think it's good, because then they can see, like, yes, that is a part of us, and those things, those terrible things that happen, they're things that can be worked on, and, you know, we are not ruined, we're not destroyed. You know, we can still have a life. And you know, so some of that is, I think, being out there and being able to talk about it, I think, is part of that, is challenging the narrative of what does a victim look like, or who is a victim, and what can they do in the world. And I think that's, you know, that is important. One of the, I mean, we have a lot of things that are similar, things that are different as well. But one of the things that struck me when I was thinking about your book is that this is, the sexual trauma happened at home, you know, for both of us, and even in our own beds. And, you know, it's supposed to be our bedrooms, and sleeping, it's supposed to be a place of safety. And I was thinking about the work that you did in this book, and how you opened up that space to the reader, and allowed other people to be in this space with you. And I wondered if you could talk about that, about your choice to let us in that room.
Yeah, that, I thought good and long and hard about that. And I was very worried. I was very worried about how to do it and how to do it well and skillfully. But in the end, what I decided was that part of the issue with the under response to rape and all the ways in which it's minimized and joked about in society, I think comes from, it comes from misogyny, but also that people almost never really talk about the enormity of the impact and the fact that it's violence. That it is, and this goes back to something you said before. I can't tell you how many times people have said to me, like if I'm going to be on a TV show or a report, or when I did a piece for to sort of talk to the police about the impact as a victim. The first question people ask you is, do you want your face blurred out? Do you want like a hidden name? As if, I understand some people actually, for safety reasons, need to protect their identity. So I'm not judging that. But there's a way in which, like, you're a tender flower and you are wounded and we are going to treat you so gently because, you need our help now. You're so damaged. And I decided that one of the ways the book was going to try to make change was to be explicit without being sensational or without being explicit in a way that was so intolerable that people couldn't read the book. So I tried to be as careful as I could to give details, but not so many details that I was uncomfortable or my children would be uncomfortable or that it was intolerable to read it. And I also did that because there are some details that while they were happening, I felt like I was, off on the ceiling somewhere. So I actually described the disassociation more than the thing that was happening. And I think that was a way for people to understand how intolerable the thing that was happening was. So it was an intentional choice. I had to think about it and talk about it with my writing professor, Alex, in order to feel like I could do it and I could, hopefully I got it right for people. I hope so.
Yes, I am sensitive to reading these kinds of scenes, and I've read a lot of them in my life, and sometimes I have to skip them. And I think you did this incredible work and with feedback and with thinking about it and maybe doing multiple attempts but it's this incredible way that you wrote about such a important part of the book, I think, and in a way that I can stay there and be there. And I feel like, okay, I can be a witness, for Michelle here and stay there with you. And I think you did such an incredible job with that, because I've read a lot of different ones and it's like really masterful and sensitive.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's really incredible. I wonder how the writing and the researching and the investigating of your crime impacted your relationship to it and impacted how you processed the trauma.
Well, for a very long time, I really didn't look externally at all about how to come to some peace of mind. And I just thought, as I struggled and suffered and felt a lot of impact from this hours of really violent and terrifying event, I just thought, well, this is now my nervous system, and this is me, and this is my reaction, and it's tough. It's really tough, but no one else is responsible for it but me. And as I read about untested rape evidence and the kinds of things that people were told when they reported their rapes, and really the hundreds of thousands of rape kits that they were finding in warehouses, like all of that, my own sense of what happened to me started to shift. And it never even occurred to me for a minute that part of it, I read a book, I'm interrupting myself, but I read a book about 10 years ago by this woman, I think her name was Susan Venable Rain, and she wrote a book called Rape in My Journey Back. And she mentions, I think it was Judith Herman's research, where she talks about that often it isn't just what happens to a victim of trauma, but it's what happens afterwards in terms of friends' responses, medical people's responses, and law enforcement, if you go to law enforcement responses, that can actually make the difference between whether you whether you have sort of this initial post-traumatic stress disorder or whether it takes on sort of a chronicity. And as I read about police behavior, and as I read about the minimization of rape, and as I heard about all the different scandals in Massachusetts in the crime lab, and then started to think, I never really heard from the police. And this was during a crime wave. No one ever, besides this one interview and one quick phone call, which I initiated, I never heard from them again. Not even to say, we haven't made any progress and we're so sorry, which, believe it or not, I actually think would have mattered. Some acknowledgement, some accountability that they tried and failed. So as I investigated and really spent time in the Boston Globe archives, and I kept looking and looking to look at the start of the sexual assault task force. And in the end, I really did feel empowered in a certain way that it wasn't just my experience, that, the sexual assault task force was started in some ways as a publicity thing for the police, that they were going to do this great job, even though the new officers hardly had any training. They almost closed 2 or 3 years after they began. And it did help me to externalize what happened and say, you know what, there are societal factors that impact victims' responses. And let's take a look at that. Let's really look at it. Let's not be afraid to be critical of what really should not be tolerated. So that's what I tried to do.
Yeah. And, those policies are so impactful. Like, for me, what happened with me was that mandated reporting for teachers and doctors came a year after a teacher had taken me aside and said, what's wrong? You're different from one day to the next, like something's happening with you, what is it?
Yeah.
And I think it's really great that she noticed me, but there was no policy. And so, that was it. And then I go on for 6 more years or 7 more years of living in the same conditions and living, with the same kind of sexual assault. So, those policies, like all these levers that you're examining and looking at, like policies and practices and storytelling even, I just think it's all so important what you're examining and challenging in this book.
Thank you.
Yeah. Maybe I'll just ask one more question and then we can look at other folks' comments and questions. But, one of the experiences that I've had with my own trauma is that it's an isolating kind of experience. And I know there's ways that, because we've all been at home and not able to see people and go out and be in the world, lots of people have been experiencing some level of this isolation as well. And I just wonder, what's some of what you have learned or about, remedies to isolation, or if you've found ways to challenge that part of us that probably wants to isolate, and what has worked for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what I would say is that, especially in the writing of this book, it's been interesting for me. Like, I have this group of they're all women that I met in doing this work on trying to understand whatever happened with all this untested rape evidence. And if I really think about it, I've probably known each of them for 2 or 3 days in my entire life, like at a conference. And yet, because we shared an experience that was so life-changing, and we also, not only the rape, or rapes, but that the police disregard, and for many of the women that I met, they, unlike me, found out who their perpetrators were, and maybe it was 16 years later, maybe it was 20 years later, for some it was up to 25 years later, they get a knock on the door or a phone call saying, you know what, now that we actually had to go through the rape evidence, we know who did this to you. And I think in the book I say that Groucho Marx line, I wouldn't want to be a part of any club that would have me as a member. I actually felt like meeting those women was really life-changing, and I'm still in touch with them. Like, they've been cheering me on with this book. That's been helpful, and I do also feel like I have the most wonderful friends and family, and I also will say that the group at Flatiron that I worked with were outstanding in terms of understanding the seriousness of this book and being incredibly, like, I felt like I was treated like a person, not like a victimized person, but like a person, like a writer, you know, and yet also aware that some material might be hard or difficult. And so the process was not more traumatizing. It actually sort of led me into feeling really good about the final product. So I guess I feel very blessed with wonderful people in my life who I feel very seen by. And Grace, you're one of them. So just saying.
Thank you. And I feel the same about you. I mean, I don't see you that often, but when I do run into you or see you, I just feel like time kind of stops and we have this moment together, and it's, you know, I really appreciate all those moments. So I'm going to go to some questions, and there's one that's directly related to what you were just speaking about, Michelle. So Kristen Paulson Wen asks, having published your books, how has this changed your relationship to your trauma? So that's similar to what I'd asked. But the next one is, the follow-up is, do you have somewhat of a feeling of containment having made meaning on those pages? So what does it mean to, like, have externalized it, and the book and the experience has become an object?
I think it's fantastic. I mean, I will be honest, I do feel like I've come back to myself in a particular way. And I don't feel scared about the title, and I don't feel anymore like, oh my gosh, what have I done? I think that was fear talking and anxiety. But I feel like that person who existed in that Brandeis Dean's office, who was yelling at the dean and thought that, you know, they could bulk mail thousands of newspapers home to parents with that alarming title and, you know, think that was fine. And the person who wanted to write for a living, who just was gone. You know, she's kind of coming back, and it's really, I enjoy seeing her. You know, I'm having a good time, feeling like that part of me, it didn't disappear. It was really way down deep, but it didn't disappear, and it feels really, really good.
Yeah, and I think the same for me. I mean, I don't have to expend energy trying to hide that story about me. Like, that story is out there and it exists. And right before I published my book, I think I was afraid that people would abandon me or wouldn't want to be my friend anymore, or wouldn't, I just was afraid of all these repercussions, even though a part of me knew that why should I have these kinds of consequences? I was the person that this had happened to. I didn't enact this on someone else.
That's right.
But there's this way that we've been made to think we'll be blamed or punished for something that happened. So like the fact that my book exists and I'll see pictures of it on Instagram or other places and it's out there in the world, there's something incredibly important about that. I mean, I still deal with it. I'm going to deal with this for the rest of my life in some way, but it's not like it is my whole life, that part of me. But having the book, because I've always wanted to be a writer, that's a dream come true in and of itself.
That's right.
So thank you, Kristen, for that. Some related questions to that is how has going public with your story elevated your voice as a survivor? And do you think it will empower others to share their story?
I do. I do. I think that more than people sharing their story, what I hope initially is that people who may have a story inside of them that they haven't ever felt like they can share, is that they really, if they read the book, can feel like there are many, many people who are taking what happened to them seriously. Because if you live in a world where you really haven't told anybody and you just read the news or you listen to some politicians who are saying, strange things and horrible things about women or about sexual assault, you can start to feel like, well, it's just me who feels impacted in a way that I'm the one who's the problem. And so maybe more people will speak out, but I hope they only speak out when they're ready. There's no judgment there. There's no, that things are going to change when everybody speaks up. I actually don't think that's going to be what brings about change. I think people will speak up when the circumstances in our society exist where they don't feel like they're going to be punished for it or mistreated for it or harmed more. And so that's what I want us to work on.
Yes. So someone asked about the terminology of victim versus survivor. And so since I said the word survivor, I think in my last question, I thought I'd bring this up.
Yeah.
And, what are your, I'll just read, at one point in the book, you objected to the term survivor, yet you generally seem to use that term. Is it situational? Which term sits better with you and why?
Right. So this may not be true for anybody else, but sometimes I feel like people can use the term survivor because it makes them feel better. Like, you're a survivor, phew, as opposed to you've been the victim of a violent crime and there is a consequence to that we as a society need to look at and try to remedy. But survivor is, like, to me, this lofty term of, like putting a crown on someone's head or something. Like, you're a survivor, you are brave, you are courageous, you are strong. And sometimes people who've been victimized by sexual violence don't feel, first of all, they don't want to be called brave, but I mean, I don't anyway. But I instead, I think it unknowingly minimizes the extent of people's experience. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't sometimes use them interchangeably, but I don't like when it's used as a way to just move on. Yeah.
Because what you're really calling for is structural change, or institutional change, societal change, not just using a word and hopefully the person will go away because they'll, be satisfied with that word.
Yeah.
So Steph Gouchville asks, did your experience of sexual violence influence your path to public health? And how did your public health lens influence your decisions and how you wrote your book?
So when I first decided to go into public health, I felt like I was at a crossroads. I had been working at a drug clinic, and I either was going to go into some sort of social work or public health, which I was still learning about at the time. And I felt like I wanted to be part of working in an organization that was doing important work, so I chose public health. I loved being in school again and using my brain again. And I do feel like what happened when I was in public health school was that the thing that hit me over and over again was that when you're looking at health issues, you cannot look at them if you don't look at the societal underpinnings related to race and gender and class and privilege, because you're not going to come up with a solution that's actually sustainable if you don't look at what's underneath. And for that, I felt like that actually did help me write the book, because it helped me sort of ground myself into how I was going to describe what was happening and how some of the superficial things weren't going to be adequate.
Right, and how this is a pervasive crime that happens and impacts people when they go to receive health services and dental services, for that matter.
Right.
You know, and I mean, the fact that we're talking now about how difficult it is, you know, to speak up, and yet, you know, it's just so pervasive. And I guess people need to also be trained about its pervasiveness and how it impacts all these aspects of our way that we are in the world, but also our health impact too. Okay, so someone has a question about, do you think your publication will be informative to medical, legal, and law enforcement professionals and help them become better trauma-informed when interacting with survivors of sexual violence?
Well, if that were to, I hope so. I really hope so. You know, you mentioned the medical profession, and I was thinking about anywhere where people have to go to be vulnerable because somebody has a skill that they need. If that person doesn't handle things in a way that makes that person feel respected and seen, they may never go back. You know, we know people who can say to us, yeah, I went to a medical clinic and they misgendered me, you know, thought I was a janitor, when I, you know, treated me with disrespect, or asked me questions about sexual assault that made me feel like they thought it was first my fault. That person may actually, that might impact them getting medical care for the rest of their life. And particularly for trauma victims, I think, who can feel like they're not sure what they deserve anymore. So yes, I think the fact that there isn't a trauma-informed requirement in medical school is so problematic, and same for police and law enforcement, that, you know, it starts with training and also better representation so that more people who are doing this work look like what society actually looks like. That would be something I would like a lot.
Yeah. There's another kind of policy question. Can we say more about mandatory reporting policies as they connect to university students specifically? As a creative nonfiction professor and rape victim, I feel conflicted about my university's mandatory reporting policy. While I understand the rationale, I don't like the idea of requiring rape survivors to tell their stories if they're not ready. Suddenly it's the rape survivor not doing something that's the problem again. I'm entirely open to pushback, though sometimes my position changes.
Yeah, that's a great question. And what I would say about that is that mandatory reporting requirements can be really, really confusing and unclear in universities, and that it's really important because what it sounds like is somebody's going to trust you with information and you're going to be required to tell somebody else their name, where it happened, who did it, and that you're not going to be able to hold their confidence. And so and sometimes, depending on how the university interprets it and their legal counsel, that might be true. For other people, what they would say is, you know what, you need to let the Office of Equal Opportunity know what happened in very broad brushes, because if there is a serial perpetrator on campus, I want to be able to come back and, you know, let this person know we exist. You don't, I know nothing about your case. I don't know if you want to report, but here are some things that if you want some help, you have a right to. And that's usually the end of it. But when professors don't feel like they have that information and somebody comes up to them and says, you know, I want to tell you something, but I'm not ready to tell anybody else, they often don't want to say, don't tell me I'm a mandatory reporter. They want to say, oh my gosh, what's going on? And so understanding the nuances is super important. I do think that it's put in place not to protect the university mostly, but really to protect individuals and make sure we don't have a community problem of safety.
That was my experience. I had just gone through some training at the new university where I worked, and they made things very clear to me. So it was clear there was multiple places to go, and I wouldn't be telling something that the student coming to me wouldn't want to know. And it did come up, and I did go to the ombuds person, and we all worked it out. And I think it was, you know, a good, there was a really good process. So. And I can say that when I was, as the student, you know, in second grade or something, I mean, the reason I was so afraid was that I just had this image that I'd be like taken away from my family.
Right.
And so that's what I thought was going to happen. So I really did want to investigate, okay, if something comes up where I work, like what is the process, what gets told, what's not get told. And like you said, it's probably different in different universities, but I wanted to make sure I knew what the rules were, I suppose.
Yeah. I'm glad. Thank you for sharing that.
So a question is, do you remember the first moment of joy you experienced in the aftermath of your assault? In all of the darkness, what kept you alive?
You know, not living actually was not something that I ever dealt with. And you know, the original version of this book was a memoir where I really was looking at family stories first, because I do know that for so many people, they struggle with the meaning of life after this kind of trauma and feeling like their career has been waylaid, and they can get suicidal. And I think that I felt hopeless and a lot of shame, but I did experience joy. I still felt loved and cherished by friends and family in a way that made me feel like my life had meaning. And maybe it had to do with my age. And like I said, I don't judge anybody else for any feelings and experiences that are different from mine. That just wasn't my experience. And in terms of moments of joy, I don't remember. I know that this happened in 1984, and you know, there were moments probably months after where I was with my friends having a meal or hearing a story that I felt joy. I remember vividly watching the Red Sox in 1986 in an apartment that I wasn't that familiar with because I had moved a million times, and watching them lose to the Mets, lose to the World Series to the Mets. And I guess that wasn't a happy moment, but it was because I was all alone. I was in a room in an apartment where I really didn't even know my roommates. And so there were definitely moments of loneliness, but there were also moments of joy. And but I think that's a very fair question.
Just a last question. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everybody's questions, One of the questions asks, what might you suggest to folks who are in a recovery process and who may have experienced sexual assault or other traumas and they're not writers?
So I mean, I don't know that everyone who's listening lives in Boston. I do feel like we are really lucky that we have so many trauma experts who practice in Boston. I do think that it is often, again, I'm not going to say it's always helpful. It is often helpful for people to do some reading. There's been some terrific books written about trauma and its impact. I remember reading Trauma and Recovery from Judith Herman and feeling like in some ways it changed my life. There are some really, really good books out there. And also it's not a bad idea to get a little bit of help from somebody who understands and is specifically trained in trauma. It can really help people realize that what they're experiencing is not something that's wrong with them, but it's a normal response to an abnormal act. And of course, you would have a huge reaction. And of course, you would feel this way, and you're not alone. And so if you're not going to be in a group to talk about that, I think talking to someone is really helpful.
Absolutely. Like the writing didn't replace therapy,
No.
for me at least.
No, it didn't.
Well, thank you so much. This was really incredible to be in conversation with you and to mark your book. And, you know, I'm so happy that it's out in the world, and I think it's going to make some really incredible change. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Grace. And thank you, Greenlight Books. I'm not sure if our coordinator is going to come back and say goodbye, but I just have to. Okay.
Michelle and Grace, thank you so much for a really powerful and important conversation. It was deeply informative and moving. I'm getting intense nonfiction books or intense nonfiction books. I really appreciated the grace and care that you handled this topic and the questions that we addressed. And we're really, really grateful for all our participants for the thoughtful questions. There's a reminder that you can still buy both Michelle and Grace's books from Greenlight. And Michelle, congratulations on the publication of a really important piece. We're so grateful to have had everyone here this evening. And we will see you next time for another event. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.